Hello and welcome back to the channel. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. So monarch butterflies are a species that are pretty easy for anyone to recognize because they have that very bright orange and black coloration. These insects are usually introduced to school-aged children during their very early education when they begin to learn about life cycles, specifically the life cycle of the butterfly. And they are well known for wintering in these warm forests, specifically in Mexico. However, there are populations in California as well. And then they're also well known for having caterpillars that depend exclusively on toxic milkweed plants. But they're also known for this massive annual migration that they make from the pretty much extremes of the North America continent. And what's really unique about this migration is that they do it over the course of several generations, with each generation taking part in a particular leg of the journey. And that's fascinating, and that's usually not something that people learn until later in their education, if at all. But that's not really what we're getting into today. Today, we're discussing how recently the Trump administration has delayed granting monarch butterflies protection under the Endangered Species Act. So grab your snowflake drink of choice. Today mine is a peppermint mocha because I'm a basic bitch, and let's get into this. Before we really jump into the issue at hand here, I would like to say that I know some people will say that I'm only sensationalizing this because Trump's name is in it, or say that the Trump name is there and I'm clearly blaming him for this decision, but that's not true. And the reason I'm putting this little disclaimer here is because this thing happened when I started talking about wolves a few weeks back. So even though Trump is not the one literally giving the order to overlook monarch butterflies as a species that needs protection, it's still a decision made by his administration, so his name is still going to be linked to it. So with that little disclaimer out of the way, let's get into exactly what has been happening. So monarch butterfly winter populations have been declining over the last 20 years or so. And the best known overwintering population occurs in the eastern population at sites in Mexico. So this decline has been seen more so in the western population, especially in the California overwintering sites. And recently some preliminary results from the 2020 Western Monarch November count indicate there are less than 2,000 migratory monarchs total at all of those overwintering sites in California. And this may seem like it's not a big deal. 2,000 is still a large number of butterflies. Well, the monarch butterfly populations in California have seen a 99% decrease in their populations. So they've gone from millions of butterflies to about 30,000 over the past few years when they've been doing these censuses throughout the different seasons and different periods in the monarch butterfly sort of life cycle and generational migration cycles. So while we have focused for the moment on the California and Western populations, there have been decreases in population in the eastern monarch butterfly population. However, it's not necessarily as dramatic as the decrease we see on the west. But both these eastern and western monarch butterfly populations have been up for considerations for federal protections. Now, they are still recognized as the same species, so technically protecting one would probably protect the other. I'm not as sure of what the nuance there would be, but monarch butterflies as a species have been up for protections under the Endangered Species Act in the United States, and it's my understanding that they've been up for protection in Canada as well. So on December 15th, 2020, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced that they have declined to grant monarch butterflies federal protection. A little bit of history here. The initial petition to begin the process of possibly giving these butterflies federal protection began in 2014 when that initial petition was received. And then an in-depth assessment began in 2016. So in that 2-ish year period, it was determined by officials that the monarch butterflies at least seemed enough at risk for an in-depth assessment to begin. And there's a very interesting thing here that I would like to show you in this particular screenshot that should be popping up somewhere on the screen. This screenshot is specifically of some text in the official press announcement from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And what it says is, after thorough assessment of the monarch butterfly's status, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has found that adding the monarch butterfly to the list of threatened and endangered species is warranted, but precluded by work on higher priority listing actions. With this decision, the monarch butterfly becomes a candidate for listing under the Endangered Species Act, and its status will be reviewed each year until it is no longer a candidate. So let's unpack that a little bit. And part of what I didn't include in this particular screenshot was that the reason why they've chosen to not list the butterflies in favor of higher priority listing actions is because evidently putting them on the list would cost too much money. And I'm sure that that would be some financial thing. However, giving them protection doesn't automatically mean there's going to be funding funneled to them. It's recognizing that they are protected and that we need to begin to do something about it. But if you go to these other higher priority listing actions, which are really hard to find, you just get a list of other things that are up for potential protection. And it's very confusing to look at. I spent some time kind of digging through that list and couldn't make a whole lot of sense of it, because they don't really give any insight as to why certain things are higher priority and certain things are lower priority. But it's that last sentence that really irks me, where it says that until they're no longer eligible for consideration. So that's basically, at least how I'm interpreting it, them saying that they're just going to leave them in this eligible status until we forget about it and all of us tree huggers and snowflakes stop yelling in their ear. But the other thing in this announcement that I want to draw attention to in this second screenshot here, you'll notice I have highlighted a few things in it. And this is particularly in a section where they're talking about the things that they use to make this determination that while monarch butterflies warrant protection, they're just not going to do it. After a thorough review of the best available scientific and commercial information, the service found that listing the monarch butterfly as an endangered or threatened species is warranted but precluded by higher priority actions to amend the list of endangered and threatened wildlife and plants. Therefore, the service is adding the monarch butterfly to the candidate list and assigning it a listing priority number of 8. This priority number indicates the magnitude of threats is moderate and those threats are imminent. So that said a whole lot, and it also said nothing at the same time. And let's talk about why. So in the first sentence of this paragraph, they are basically admitting that this decision is heavily influenced by companies that have a financial interest in keeping the environmental regulations the same or weakening them. And this has been noted in some other articles that I've read that are linked down below, that pesticide manufacturers in particular, like Monsanto, are heavily against the the listing of monarch butterflies as a threatened or endangered species, because that would mean they have to reformulate pesticides. That would mean that their particular pesticides that may or may not be impacting this decline that we're seeing, especially in the Western population, needs to cease use. And they do not want that. The fact that they used commercial information as well as scientific information is deeply disturbing to me, because I don't think that commercial information should ever be held at the same level as scientific consensus or scientific information. Basically, what they're admitting is that they are listening to what the scientists saying, yeah, these butterflies are a threatened species, but we don't care. We're not going to add them to the list because of this commercial information. And also in this press release, they don't reference directly any of the information they use. And that is a big problem for me when we have these government agencies saying that they're listening to specific science and stuff and then not listing it. We also saw this in previous videos I've made about wolves and pretty much any other conservation topic we've talked about when the United States government under the Trump administration is doing something fucky. So let's go down to the other part of this quote where they're talking about the priority number. So the butterflies were assigned a priority number of 8, which again means magnitudes of threats is moderate and those threats are imminent. That is particularly where they say nothing. And it's just, it seems like a bunch of nonsense, because how can threats be both moderate and imminent? Moderate is a word that has a connotation that means not a big deal, we're all good, while imminent has a particular connotation that seems to be more intense. And I don't understand the wording they chose, because it completely contradicts itself within a handful of words. So either the threat to the monarch butterflies is moderate or it is imminent. I don't necessarily see how it can be moderate and imminent. And a priority number of 8, when I was looking at the information, is fairly high up there. So it seems like this particular word salad that they're giving us is trying to placate people and cover up the fact that they don't care that monarch butterflies do warrant protection, which they admitted. They just then in that same sentence said they don't care. So this whole press release is basically a bunch of word salad that's a slap in the face to the people who have been working hard on the monarch butterfly conservation, at least since 2014 and likely since before then. Because remember, in Western populations, we're seeing a 99% decline in the butterfly populations, and that is a big deal. So now that we've talked about the particular press release, let's move into what exactly is threatening the butterflies. The things that are threatening monarch butterflies and that are listed in the sources I have linked, I believe it's the National Park Service one that kind of gave it the most concise listing, so check out that link for sure. There's a loss of winter habitat in all of their wintering places through deforestation, harsh weather over winters, and human development, which of course is leading towards that deforestation and the loss of that habitat. There's a hypothesized loss of milkweed. Now, this is particularly troublesome in areas with a lot of agriculture, so Midwest and the Western areas where there's a lot of farming, because the milkweed is going to be often removed as a pest plant. It is seen as a weed, but again, the milkweed is what the caterpillars depend on. While the adults feed on a bunch of different host plants and get a lot of different pollens, the host plant for the species is milkweed. Caterpillars survive on milkweed. So if we're losing milkweed, there's less places for the butterflies to lay their eggs. There's less places for the caterpillars to grow and develop. And again, because milkweed is considered a weed, it gets removed, and that's makes way for the large farms and makes way for more human development, because there are places where, like, for example, property owners associations won't allow you to plant milkweed in your front yard because it's a weed. I have a strong feeling that that's a thing that my POA and I are going to argue about in the coming spring and summer, but I have time on my hand and I like writing 10-page papers for no reason, so I hope they enjoy that. But the other big thing that's affecting butterflies, that we know is affecting the butterflies, is climate change. Because the extreme hot and the extreme cold we see in the oscillations of these climate patterns that are kind of out of control are both deadly to the butterflies. So it's not just that we're seeing these really long hot summers in like California killing them. It's that when we have these cold snaps in other places as well, that also is very deadly to them. So why exactly should these monarchs be protected? Well, while they're not technically a keystone species like the wolves are, they are a large source of food for other organisms, so birds and other critters that feed on insects a lot. During the periods of time that their ranges overlap with where the monarch butterflies are, the monarch butterflies provide a stable source of food when their populations are not pretty much at 1% of where they used to be. So without the source of food, it just creates strain on the predator species as well as other prey species that now are being preyed upon more heavily. And then they're pollinators. Like I said, the adult butterflies do not just pollinate milkweed. They pollinate all sorts of things. So by losing one pollinator, it's going to impact everything. And the thing is, we don't exactly know how. And then they are a species that can be used to indicate ecosystem health. So because we're seeing these declines in the monarch butterfly population, it's kind of a red flag that the ecosystem at large may be about to start showing more severe symptoms of problems. And we see this a lot with amphibian species because they are so sensitive to environmental changes. They're used as an indication of a very poor ecosystem or a very healthy ecosystem, depending on how their populations are doing. And the monarch butterflies are potentially a species that can be used for that as well, especially since we're seeing these big differences between these western and eastern populations. It's indicating that there's something going on in the west that's not necessarily impacting the east as heavily, but it could be an early warning sign that the east is going to follow suit, just perhaps not as rapidly. So that is something that needs to be looked at. But despite all this good stuff that these butterflies are, they're pretty much iconic with the elementary school students. They're these very important pollinators, the important source of food for other critters, and the whole kind of thermometer for how an ecosystem is doing potentially. There is opposition to federal protection of monarch butterflies that is not directly from like pesticide companies and things that would have to put some sort of financial hardship because of protection for these butterflies. So in a Wildlife Society bulletin paper, which I would like to point out, the Wildlife Society, while it is technically an academic journal, it has an impact factor of 0.967, and an impact factor basically indicates how impactful a journal is. So the higher the impact factor, the more important, the more prestigious, the better the journal is in general. The lower the impact factor, the less influential the journal is, and the more you have to kind of question how reliable the articles are, because it's going to be easier to get into these journals. The peer review might not be as rigorous. So a journal like Nature, which has a very high impact factor, is a very hard journal to get into. You can pretty much, well, you should always look into the claims of any paper published anywhere. The papers in that journal are going to be more reliable, whereas the papers in something like Wildlife Society Bulletin of an impact factor of less than 1, you're gonna have to perhaps question what the papers say and do more research. So in this particular paper, and again, all my sources are linked down below, even this opposition stuff, because I want you to be able to go ahead and read and make your own conclusions as well, advocates for voluntary individual action as opposed to federal protection. So that's interesting, because we see where places are expected to be voluntary. Yeah, you'll see some areas actually do that and do the right thing, but in general, because doing the right thing pisses off companies like Monsanto and stuff, it's probably not going to happen, which is why federal protection is actually necessary to force the issue of protection. And it also argues that because the eastern population shows no conclusive evidence of dramatic decline, the species in general is not in danger. So yeah, the eastern population is probably not in imminent danger like the western population is, but that doesn't mean the species is not in danger. It doesn't mean just because your eastern butterflies are still partying it up out there that the western population is not fighting for existence at the moment. It doesn't mean that there's not a problem. It just means that one particular population is doing better than another population, and that kind of means we need to figure out why, and if putting a federal protection on these animals is going to help us figure out why and help those populations restabilize, then why wouldn't we do that just because one population is doing okay? This is the exact same argument with the wolves, saying that because wolves are not endangered worldwide, they shouldn't be protected in the United States, which is just an absolutely asinine argument. But I digress on that one. I apologize for the jingling in the background. My duck has decided that it's time to play with her bell, so if you can hear that, I apologize. Winston and now Norman have decided that it's time for Belle. And again, this is their world. I just exist in it. So we got what we got. Okay. So moving on, there's one other opposition paper thing that I would like to discuss. And this one was written by Dr. Andrew Davis. So he is an ecologist. He does do research on monarch butterflies. He does research on migration through, I want to say, a university in Georgia, but I did not write it down. So pardon me if I'm wrong, but the paper's linked down below. There's a link to his blog post talking about the paper, which frankly, I'd probably go read that before I read the paper, because the paper in itself is really hard to get through. But the interesting thing about this paper is that, so it's a literature review, and literature reviews are useful. Literature reviews basically take a body of knowledge that we have and synthesize it and propose future avenues for research. They're a very useful part of the science realm. But the interesting thing about this literature review is it's not published in a peer-reviewed journal yet. According to his website and the blog post about it, it is currently in a peer review process. He doesn't mention with what journal, which I find a little suspect. And like I said, the link, why would you publish something through a site that's known to lack credibility just to have a non-peer reviewed paper out? Well, good news, he answers that in his blog post about it. So basically in his blog post, where he summarizes his article and talks about kind of why he went about doing this literature review, he wanted this to be available prior to decisions made by the United States looking at the protection of the butterflies, because he is against federal protection. Which, fine, you can hold whatever view you want. But this paper is again relying on data from the eastern population. And basically he says that federal protection is not necessary because of the apparent health of the eastern population, which is, again, interesting. And if you read his blog post, the first couple of paragraphs where he's talking about why he did this literature review, while he doesn't say that he went out to support his already pre-made conclusion, it does read as that. I didn't pull direct quotes from it, but I do have the blog post linked down below, and I want to say it's the second or third paragraph where he's talking about putting his money where his mouth is, perhaps the fourth. It's kind of a long blog post, and it's kind of a long paper too. Where it just gives off the tone that he had already made his own conclusion and was just looking to support that conclusion, which is not good science. Now, again, that is all alleged. I don't know that that's actually what he did. That's just the interpretation that I had when I read his blog post. So basically, the paper itself is a 26-page paper that only has 2 paragraphs in 26 pages talking about the Western population. Now, according to his abstract, his introduction, all that jazz, the reason why he didn't talk about the Western population or really look at data about the Western population is because supposedly there's not enough to work with for the Western population. And I find that doubtful because I did a quick search on several different academic databases, and I found at least 5 studies published in the last 5 years specifically on the Western populations of the monarch butterflies. Now, he did his research and wrote the paper in the course of last year, and while a couple of these papers may not have been available, there were papers available. So I'm not sure why. Well, yeah, most of the data is from the eastern population because that's the more well-studied population. I'm not sure why you would claim that there's quote, virtually no data on the Western population when I, doing a very rudimentary search, found papers on the Western population. I mean, that's just a little sus. But I digress there, because who am I to be taking on a big bad PhD that clearly would never have ulterior motives because he's a scientist? And then another big point he makes is that milkweed shows no decline based on summer butterfly populations in the east being okay. And last time I checked, in ecology, we don't say that the population of one thing is okay because the population of another thing is okay. Because doing a count on butterfly populations is not the same as going out and doing a count on milkweed populations. That, yeah, you can hypothesize and infer that milkweed populations are probably doing okay because the butterfly populations are doing okay. So there's at least enough available to sustain the caterpillars. I do see what you're doing there, but I don't necessarily think that basically you're just supposing there, and I don't think that should necessarily be included in an academic paper. And that is usually something that would be weeded out during peer review. And so there are mentions in the blog post, specifically not the paper, that the Western milkweed abundance doesn't appear to be affected, according to his own colleagues. Again, there's no data cited. This particular mention is just anecdotal evidence. So obviously that wasn't included in his paper because he has no citations for it. You can stretch the eastern thing a little more because you can cite the butterfly populations, but by saying that the milkweed has to be okay because the butterflies are okay is not okay. So again, before I move on, the blog post, when I read it, just kind of gave me the feeling that he set out to prove his predetermined conclusion, and that's bad science. Again, that is just my interpretation of it. That's not me saying that's for sure what he did. But before we conclude, I would like to mention something that's a little bit of an aside. So last year, the Trump administration actually made it more difficult for species to be added to the list of threatened and endangered species. And notably, the thing that they added that I think needs to be highlighted is that the government is now able to put a cost on saving species. So basically, you're allowed to look at the money involved, which is not, it's nuanced and it's not black and white, but it does kind of start to allow the government to say, oh, well, if we continue doing things the way we are and not save the species, in the end, it's going to save us money. And the thing is, you can't necessarily reliably put a dollar amount on the environment. You can't necessarily put a reliable dollar amount on the worth of a species. To say that you can is just ridiculous. And this seems to be what has ultimately blocked the monarch butterfly decision. And that is directly despite the rapidly declining Western population. And I say this specifically because they do cite not having enough resources in the press announcement, but they don't elaborate on that at all. When you take into consideration the actions last year that make it harder to add species to this list of endangered and threatened species, and the wording of this very long press announcement that ultimately just says the same couple of things over and over, it seems like this is just kind of a cop-out and them signaling to the corporate donors that ultimately control a large swath of the government and the elected officials at the moment through donations that they're not going to let this protection of species get in the way of those companies' economic development. And that is concerning to me because our environment and our environmental actions should be based on science, not the economic will of corporations. So basically, this whole idea that there's not enough money to put a species on a list is kind of a cop-out, because adding the species to the list doesn't mean immediately spending on the species. It means recognizing it and then taking a step back and determining how we go about this now that it's been added. And just any more protections have been stalled because we don't have them on the list. So scientists that would be working on the project now can't because they're not on the list. But I kind of digress there. So yeah, there are differences in those eastern and western monarch butterfly populations, but that doesn't negate the fact that they are in peril, especially that western population. And while the eastern population appears to not be in immediate danger, the western population may be an indicator of what may happen in the future without protections. And if milkweed really is no longer a problem, like the one article that I was talking about said, then why is the western population in decline? Is it climate change? Is it pesticide use? And again, if it is pesticide use, that implies that the decision to not list the butterflies does just reek of corporate interest. And then the opposition that I did mention that pops up when you do like scholarly searches comes from a very low impact journal and an article that has yet to be peer reviewed by a researcher whose most recent publications are in a journal that he is the editor-in-chief of. I know I didn't mention that when I was talking about the article before, but that is something that irks me greatly. Well, I do recognize that I'm sure a lot of the papers that are listed on his university website, where he's a co-author of, are wonderful papers, and some of them have been published in fairly prestigious journals. The fact that his more recent papers are in a journal that he's the editor-in-chief of makes me wonder exactly where this unpeer-reviewed paper is up for peer review in that's pre-published. And just a quick note on that paper, or that journal, I couldn't even find an impact factor for it, so it's a journal. But I digress on that point. That's more of a please check your sources and have an idea of where you're getting information from. But the big picture here is the Trump administration has done horribly when we talk about the environment, when we talk about protecting anything that's not a big business. And they've just done it again by putting monarch butterfly conservation on the back burner. And that's horrifying to me. But as of right now, we can count the days till that monster and that administration is out of office. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you, and I will see you all in the next one. Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane V. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.